Welcome to the Cloudless Mind podcast about neuroscience, non-duality, and change management. Introducing your host, Scott Byrd.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cloudless Mind podcast. Today, I'm your host, Scott Byrd, and I'm joined by my friend, colleague, and just overall great guy, Chris Smith from the Campfire Effect. And the reason why we are having Chris on today is basically from our last conversation we had with Mark Robin from the huge company in Europe, SAP, the CTO. And he spent a lot of time talking about how story is incredibly important to what they're up to. You know, they've got a lot of really interesting stuff going on, and he spoke in our last podcast about, developing a story in order to create the vision. So I've asked Chris to come on today because I don't know anyone better. Chris is, I'd say, one of the top authorities in the country in creating story as it pertains to vision. So why don't we dive right in today? And Chris, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself a little bit, and then we will get into the topic of the day.
Yeah, first of all, really grateful for the opportunity to be here. And I love anytime I have the chance to talk about story, specifically around this idea of vision and purpose and identity because I think sometimes it's easy to talk about story as it relates to like marketing and branding and selling. But story to me can be so much more than that in shaping vision and culture. So I've always been fascinated with story. I grew up in a cowboy ranching rodeo family, actually, believe it or not, and grew up around cowboy storytellers. And in sixth grade, at the year-end school assembly, my mom said she knew what my future was going to be because at the end of the year, I was given the award for least likely to be found in my seat. Because I was always up telling stories. I was always up talking to kids and getting in trouble. But I just loved telling stories. I loved influencing. And so that kind of shaped my path as I went throughout my professional career. And I was in sales for a long time, but I always used story to sell. I was always a high producing salesperson, but through the power of story. And then as I worked in some of these companies, I saw that story could have a much bigger impact than just selling. Like the story was actually the foundation for everything. It could be, if approached correctly, it could be the foundation for the vision, for the culture, for hiring, for unity, for engagement. Like the story actually was the source of all clarity and all alignment for an organization.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you say that. First of all, I love how you distinguish that we're not necessarily talking in this podcast about story like people think in the marketing space and that area. We're mainly focused on story as it relates to vision creation. So first of all, thanks for that context. Can you talk a little bit about, what it would be like if someone came to you as a company or corporation, and they're struggling in this vision creation process? Can you give us a sense of how you think about that? I mean, when you first interact with a company?
Totally. What's so interesting, Scott, is when we work with an existing company and they're coming to work with us around vision, typically they have an existing vision statement in place. Along with existing mission statement and values. And what's interesting is when we start digging into their story, like who they really are and like where they came from and when the company started and the origin, and we compare that story to the existing like mission statement, vision statement, and values, you don't find any of their authentic story and who they really are in any of the mission, vision, or values. It's always like what, and so it's almost like companies go through a mission statement creation or a vision statement creation and values exercise, and it's almost like it's this creative brainstorming like session where we see how cool our vision statement can sound, but it's not anchored to anything about who they actually are.
Right. So what you're saying is your experience is that companies typically are almost like, mimicking what they think that their values should be.
Totally. And like their values, mission, and vision is totally built from a place of what we think it should be or what we're supposed to create.
Right.
But not based on like who we actually authentically are and who we have been. And one of my favorite quotes is by Steve Jobs. He said, you never connect the dots looking forward. You always connect the dots looking backwards.
Wow. I love that. Let's expand on that a little bit.
Well, like I really believe, and I think what Steve Jobs was saying was like, all the answers are actually in the past. We're such a future focused, society right now, and we're always on the go, and we're always just like running and sprinting, that we never take time to pause and reflect on like, but who are we and where have we been? Like, where have we come from? And I really think that in order to know where you're going, you got to know where you've come from. Yeah, sometimes it's just getting a company to pause. And so when we help them with their vision, it's almost like we say, okay, let's hold that conversation for a second around vision. Let's actually do a little bit of work. Can you guys tell me the year your company started? Tell me who the original founders were. Why did it start? Because in that origin story is always like something really powerful and really profound and really inspiring. Like, most companies were really taking a stand for something or taking a stand against something or following their calling. But over the years of doing their business, they've kind of lost sight of their true identity. They've lost sight of the calling. And so if they develop a vision from that place, it'll be a vision that's what they think it should be or what it's supposed to be. But if we can kind of reconnect them back to who they really are and their calling, their identity, and where they've come from, they're more likely to tap into something that's authentic to who they really are, and it can be really sustainable.
Yeah. Well, let me dig a little bit deeper in that, because something that you said is interesting to me. So there's typically a gap that you see when you go in there. There's a gap between what they've stated out there and if you were to really dig deep, who they really are. Why do you think that is, first of all?
Well, I think if I can actually talk about a company that might be useful, I think like Kodak. Let's take Kodak, for example.
Sure.
Kodak's original vision when they set out as a company, right? Their identity, what they stood for, their calling, their vision was to help the world create memories. I mean, they even trademarked the phrase Kodak moment, which kind of became like a verb, like Google it or use a Kleenex, right? It's like, Kodak moment, whether you were using a Kodak camera, Kodak film or not. But somewhere along the way, Scott, in the busyness of growing a billion-dollar company and making tons of film, they actually forgot that vision. Like they lost sight of who they really were, and they lost sight of their calling, as I refer to it. And so then they started having this reflection of, well, we're a company that sells a lot of film. Like that's our vision, right? And I think that's why that gap exists, is because we forget like who we are. It takes real work and effort to remind ourselves. It's not like we go through this exercise one time to figure out our calling and our identity and our purpose and who we are, and then we don't ever have to revisit it again. And if you're not careful, as you're growing a business and keeping up with the demands of that business, it's so easy to lose connection to your roots, to like where you've come from. And like, because I've never worked with a company when we dig back into the roots, like the origin story, there isn't something really, really profound. So that gap, I think, exists because we've got so focused on what we're doing to grow a company and grow a business that we've kind of lost sight of like why we started doing it in the first place.
This example with Kodak, I think, is incredible because, it's quite evident that how the company has, evolved, and it hasn't evolved in a way that it would have it proliferate in a way that you think it could have been given the name brand that it had for all those years. Right. So it seemed to have gotten distracted by what, again, like how we started, how you think how the world thinks you should be. Now, that doesn't mean that companies won't evolve. But what I hear you saying is, unless there is that expression of the DNA of who the company really is and how it was founded, then there's an enormous amount of power that's lost. And from that loss of power, you're going to be susceptible to the whims of the market and all of that from a DNA standpoint, right? So that is fascinating, and that's something that with this, where we are in this day and age, with all of the different things that are coming at us, it's more important than ever to stay connected to your story, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, it's never been. There's such a lack of human connection in the world today.
Yeah.
Right. But that doesn't mean that people want less of it. In fact, people crave it more. now than ever, because there's so little of it, and we're bombarded with so much noise and so many opportunities. Like, it's the most amazing time in the history of the world, right? The amount of opportunities in front of us. But it's also really easy, if you're not careful, it's really easy as an organization to start to operate from a place of opportunity.
What it sounds to me like is that through the loss of this story, what's really lost is connection and trust. Because when you and I share a story, if I'm going to try to create memories, and I'm looking to, this is really important to me, and I know that Kodak is the one that is most focused on that. So we're actually sharing a story, and this goes back many, many thousands and maybe even millions of years, right? Whereas unless we both share the same story, we don't have trust. Can you talk a little bit about trust as it pertains to story?
Yeah, like the foundation for human connection and trust is like your authentic story as an organization and as an individual. And when you lose connection to that story and you lose connection on how to share it, not just with the public and consumers, but also with your own internal team, well, if people can't connect with it, they can't trust it. And when we lose connection with our own story, then there's no way that our employees or our clients and customers are going to be able to connect with it. Like, I've got into companies before, Scott, where the current executives can't tell me the year the company started.
Right. Yeah.
Like, they've totally lost connection. What's interesting is the guy that developed the first ever digital camera, Steve Sasson, and took it to Kodak. It's so fascinating to read about that story because he had Kodak executives tell him, pull him aside and be like, "Hey, Steve, dude, by the time this technology is relevant, I'll be long gone. I don't care." How does that happen? Well, that's totally like when you lose connection to the story of who you are, right? You lose connection to the story of like what you're creating and what you stand for. Yeah, like that lack of connection creates a lack of trust. Like, I can't trust something that I don't know how to connect with. And I can't connect with it if I don't know the story, if I don't understand and it's two parts, Scott. So when we work with a company, we take them back to their own roots to remind them of who they really are and what their calling is. And then we create the vision from that place. But that's only one part of it. You then have to take that vision and share it with your entire organization in a way where they can actually now see how their story is intertwined with the company's story.
Ah, yes. Yeah, that's what I was going to point at, because in some respects, a revolving door of employees and stuff, if what you're saying is if you haven't in the hiring process had an elemental part of the person that you're going to hire be able to connect and trust the story and believe in the same story, then you're really setting yourself up for what could happen, like what happened at Kodak, right?
Totally.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, we're the most lasting organizations. Well, we could take religion. I mean, we're not going to get into a religious, but in many cases, different ways that people have their faith are revolved around a story that they believe in. Right? So that's a long-term example of what the power of story is.
Yeah. If I see that the organization that I'm affiliated with, religious or the company I work for, or a company that I'm a consumer of, if I'm really clear on their story and I can connect with it and I can trust it, but then I also see how my story is intertwined in it, man, that's called staying power. That's called loyalty. Like, I'm sticking around for a really, really long time. And probably I'm sticking around until the company loses sight of their own story and I can no longer connect with it, or maybe I lose sight of my own. But the reality is, as long as those two things are intact, whether I'm an employee, whether I'm a client, whether I'm a investor, I'm not going anywhere. As long as I can connect with the story and trust it through the lens of the company story and through my own.
That's incredibly powerful. A lot of what we speak to in our work is how these connections get made from a neuroscience, from a brain level. What we're really dealing with is a bunch of brains that are interacting with each other in many ways. And we're also dealing with the thought patterns and the belief patterns of people and brains. And what you're speaking to right now is how the most powerful connections get made that have the most staying power.
Yeah. And there's actually a way to tell your story as a company about your vision. There's a way to tell the story of your vision to your people in a way that makes sense, which means that they then can connect with it and trust it. And this is all based on like how the brain's hardwired for context. There's also a way to share the story of your vision with your people in a way that doesn't make sense to them. It's like, well, okay, that's just the vision you guys came up with, and it doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, I can't connect with it. I don't trust it. So it's just like the profoundness of what you're saying, and we could talk about this for hours, but it's like there's a power in the place you create your vision from, but then there's also real science behind how you share the story of that vision.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things. There is an element of a machine nature of this. Like if you create it in a certain way, it will create a certain output, right? And done on a consistent basis, you have the real possibility of having a lot of confidence. Well, first of all, in your story, but in what the story will produce.
Right.
But I would love for you to speak a little bit about your process and how you go and work through this with a company.
Yeah, so the thing that I often talk with an organization about in the beginning, when we're first engaging, we're first working together, is to say, look, we've got to start shifting from this place of operating from a place of opportunity to start to like operate more from a place of alignment. And what I mean by that is opportunity is where all of the should and supposed to lives, right? We should be saying this. We're supposed to be doing this. Our vision should look like this. The alignment side of that is like, this is what we feel called to say. This is who we feel called to work with. So what I believe is that every individual and every company, there's a calling they have that's way deeper than should or supposed to. It's like, I feel called.
It's authentic to them.
Yeah. It's like it's just who they kind of naturally are. Like that's the calling, but we've got to like almost give them the space and create the space for them to like hear the calling and turn off all of this like marketing and advertising and branding speak for a minute,
right,
and get away from like the future focused nature and get them in the present and give them opportunity to also look back at the past of where they've come from. So what's interesting is the left side of the brain is responsible for the past and the future. And the left side of the brain is like the analytical, it's the problem solve, it's like always working, right?
Right.
The right side of the brain is where the present is found. It's like today, like intuition and creativity. And we've got to engage both right and left side in the vision creating process, because it's like a little bit of looking back at our past, right? Left side of the brain. It's also being present to like who we really are and what we want to create, right side of the brain. But the way we get to it, Scott, is we actually ask a company, like, what is it that you really feel called to say out there in the world more than anything? Forget about marketing. And I'm not talking about marketing. Like, what do you really feel called to share with the world in one sentence? If we could define everything you stand for and everything you feel called to say in one sentence, well, that's pretty tough. Like sometimes that's a several hour long exercise. But what I've always found, I've never found a company that there isn't something there. And then once we get down to that, this is what we really feel called to say, Chris, more than anything, this is what we're trying to say. Then we put that on like a set of glasses and we look at the past and where they've come from through that lens, and we start to find evidence of it, of why they feel called to say that.
That's so fascinating. And I've actually had the benefit of being able to be in the room when you do go through this process, and it's unbelievable. And people walk out in many ways liberated. And what happens is they start to experience an effortlessness in their communication and how they speak about their company that they didn't have before, because it was always coming from kind of a manipulative point of view. They were thinking they needed to hit all the different points. And what you're speaking to is really creating that authenticity. And from authenticity, it's always effortless. There's no pain, there's no brain damage in trying to communicate something, right? You simply are being who you are in that without effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's so funny about that is when we first ask them that question, like, what is it that you guys feel called to say more than anything? Their first responses, maybe even for the first 2 hours, are all from a place of what they think they should say, what they're supposed to say, and we just keep giving them permission over the course of that day to be like, no, like, what do you feel called to say? And for some of them, they've been operating so long from a place of should and supposed to. It's like, I don't even know what you're talking about calling. I don't even know what that means anymore, right? But when we tap into it and they're like, yes, this is what we're really trying to say. And the power of doing it, Scott, too, with their executives is it's like everyone's accountable to it now. Like no one can unsee what we just did that day, right? It's like if an executive tries to then go off and take the vision in a completely different direction, it's like, wait, like that's not what we got aligned to as a team. Like that's not the clarity of what we landed on around like who we actually authentically are. Because So yeah, I just want companies to have a vision. I mean, simply put, I want companies to have a vision that's aligned with who they actually are, because that way it's sustainable and people can trust it and connect with it. First and foremost, your own people, your internal people.
Chris, incredibly well done in terms of describing the importance of understanding what we're talking about. Really great job. Well, we're going to end it here today, but I can say, if you're open to it, that we'd like for you to come on, if you're open to it, in several weeks, and we'll go deeper into the kind of the mechanistic process of what not only happens in your process, but also what's happening in the brain. Right. So, because it's important for us to know, the brain has been opened up for us. And if we're not really looking at what the functionality is of it as it relates to what we're trying to create, then we're missing a boat. So thanks a lot for coming today, for being with us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And if you'd like to know more about Chris, where can they find you, Chris?
Yeah. So campfireeffect.com. You can find out more information about us. And I love this conversation. Again, I love going into the deep end of the swimming pool on story, about vision, culture, transformation. Like, I love talking about the transformation side of story more than the tactical side of story, I guess is the way of saying it. And Scott, you guys are doing that. And so I would absolutely love to come back on the podcast and dive deep.
Well, thank you so much, my man. And we will we'll definitely have that on in a couple of weeks. And for everyone else, anyone that would like to learn a little bit more about what we're up to, we're at cloudlessmind.com and just released a book that we wrote. And you can find that on Amazon by the same name, A Cloudless Mind. So thank you, and we'll talk to you next time.